In 1942, and in somewhat of a panic over the state of their own heavy tank program, Britain asked the United States to begin a joint project to create an assault tank. The American design would culminate in the T14, while the British would create the A33 Excelsior. But after nearly 3 years of development, the project was cancelled in late 1944, with only 4 vehicles produced out of a planned 8,500. Both designs had their merits, so why did all this work go to waste? What killed the Allied assault tanks? To get to the bottom of this, we must first look at the vehicle that Britain had produced before the project began, namely the A-22 Churchill. Churchill was not a heavy tank, nor was it an assault tank. It was an infantry tank. These vehicles, in British armoured doctrine, would be relatively slow, but heavily armed and heavily armoured, and would accompany, as the name suggests, the infantry. The Churchill design was based on the rather incorrect assumption that a Second World conflict would play out much like the First: trench warfare, muddy terrain, and mostly frontal assaults. In fact, very early designs had sponson-mounted 2-pounder guns, and a turret was only added on later. Britain was concerned that the Churchill was outdated. Its 2-pounder main armament, while still being relatively potent in the early war period, was not an effective assault weapon, and so Churchills mounted a 3-inch howitzer in the front of the vehicle to destroy fortifications and emplacements. The design was cumbersome, slow, unreliable, and largely outdated, as would be proven in the Dieppe raid of late 1942. Of course, the Churchill was not the only reason why this raid failed, but the British wanted a new tank that would eventually replace it, perhaps as early as 1943. Meanwhile, across the pond, the US Army had developed their own heavy tank, the M6, and boy was it heavy. 57 metric tons of American steel. It featured a large turret with a high caliber gun, double wide tracks, thick frontal armour and armoured side skirts. The Americans had been working on this design for a number of years, and clearly had some idea of how to make a modern heavy tank, despite the M6 slightly falling short of what the US Army had originally wanted. And so, Britain asked them for help. They proposed a joint project and wanted the Americans to design an assault tank to their specifications, while the British would work on their own competing design using some American components and knowledge. The British wanted to order 8,500 of the chosen vehicle, and so to aid logistics, the American design would be loosely based on the M4, and the British design would focus on adapting the A27 Cromwell. The influence of the M4 on the American design is immediately apparent, and it's easy to dismiss this vehicle as just some fat Sherman. But the T14, as this vehicle would be known, was a completely new design. It did use the Sherman's transmission and drivetrain and mounted the same 75mm gun, but the similarities largely end there. The armour on the T14, while being the same 2-inch thickness as the M4, was sloped at a much steeper angle of 60 degrees, giving the vehicle more than 100mm of effective protection. The transmission cover's armour was also increased, with the front of the cover being cast at 4 inches thick. Even the side and rear of the hull were 2 inches thick and angled at 30 degrees. The new turret was also much better protected, with the front offering 3 inches of protection sloped at 30 degrees, and the sides and rear were 4 inches thick. It was an incredibly impressive armour layout, considerably better than anything the British or Americans had at this point in the war. However, it was also incredibly heavy, at nearly 43 tons. This is more than 10 tons heavier than the Sherman, and thus required a more powerful engine. The Sherman M4A3 used the Ford GAA V8, but the T14 had the more powerful GAZ, with space left for a possible upgrade to a V12 engine down the line. T14 used double wide tracks to try and spread out this extra weight, and used the same suspension as the M6, HVSS bogies arranged in pairs along the length of the hull. With the extra weight, the T14 managed a top speed of around 24 miles per hour. It was a little slow, but considering its protection and the role it was designed for, it was acceptable. The Churchill could only manage around 15 miles per hour, for example. One of the more unique features of the T14 is the addition of side skirts. T14 was being designed for use by the British, remember, and they felt it necessary to protect the sides of the vehicle and the suspension where possible. These so-called bazooka plates were either 1 inch or half an inch thick and hung down over the sides of the hull, but more on that later. The British A33, originally meant to be a modified Cromwell, ended up sharing pretty much nothing with the original A27. Its predecessors, the A28, A31 and A32, were much more similar to the Cromwell, and attempted to add armour to the vehicle while retaining the 5-wheel Christie suspension system. These were abandoned in favour of the A33, which would use a brand new suspension design, or to be more accurate, 2 different suspension designs. The A33, made to the same specification as T14, had very similar armour protection, but it was achieved slightly differently. Instead of sloping a thinner plate, the A33 would simply thicken the armour of the Cromwell, with the front plate being increased to 4.5 inches and the lower frontal plate 2 inches but angled at 70 degrees. The inner side armour was 2 inches thick, but the vehicle did enjoy increased protection from the 1 inch thick side skirts. The turret protection was very similar, with the front being increased to 4.5 inches, the sides 3.5 and the rear being 3 inches, the same as the rear of the hull. But not all A33s looked like this one. The first A33 pilot, known as A33-1 or A, would mount the same suspension system as the M6, and by extension the T14. You can see in this image the early pilot with his M6 style side skirts, but including the very British side escape hatches. These side hatches would have a 1 inch thick steel tube connecting them to the crew compartment through the middle of the tracks. Definitely not somewhere I would like to be stuck in a life or death situation, especially given the small size of these openings. The vehicle would mount a 6-pounder as planned, would weigh in at around 40 tons, and was powered by the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, the same as Cromwell apart from a few minor modifications. The A33 would enjoy almost exactly the same top speed as the T14, around 25 miles per hour. Pilot versions of both the T14 and A33 were built and then tested throughout 1943. The M6 style suspension proved troublesome. American reports mention the bogies being damaged, especially the outside centre set. This report also mentions the fact that the vehicle would frequently throw its tracks and recommends serious improvements to the entire suspension system. But perhaps the most infuriating aspect of the design was the side skirts, especially when the suspension system needed constant repair and replacement. Every time track access was required, these plates needed to be folded up or removed entirely, making regular maintenance incredibly difficult. British testing came to largely the same conclusion, although they seemed to have far less issues with the suspension itself. After a 1,000-mile test, the Brits only had some minor complaints. The vehicle did pick up over 2 tons of mud during this trial, which apparently didn't affect their performance, but obviously wasn't ideal. They have been working on their own suspension design, using more grippy tracks, which would be implemented on the second pilot, known as A33-2 or A33B. This vehicle mounted the upgraded suspension system known as the RL type, which is also bogie-based but was meant to improve reliability and ride quality. In actuality, this suspension was complicated and expensive and was not without its own reliability issues. But, due to this change in suspension, the second pilot mounted side skirts which covered the entire hull. It was also produced with the QF 75mm gun to match the Cromwell's upgraded armament at that time in the war. The first pilot was retrofitted with this weapon as well. You might have noticed that I have been very well behaved and I've only referred to the A33 as the Excelsior once in the intro. This is because the A33 was never called the Excelsior. The name doesn't appear in any of the literature surrounding A33 and nobody is quite sure where it came from. A more likely name that was at least mentioned was Commodore, but this name had also been attributed to another vehicle, the A40, so probably safe just to call it the A33 for now. The A33 and T14 were both good vehicles that met the specification and by all accounts would have been fit for purpose. However, during these vehicles' development, the Churchill had got some serious upgrades. It had become much more reliable, mounted a 6-pounder gun in a new thicker turret, had been widened, had thicker armour, and had a limited 3-inch howitzer. It really made no sense to attempt to replace Churchill with the war so evidently about to come to a close. The Americans had only ever had very limited interest in the T14, but this interest had faded long ago, and they had in fact fielded their own assault tank, the Sherman Jumbo, which was performing relatively well. The T14 and A33 just weren't needed anymore, and both projects were shelved. In the end, 2 pilots were made of each of these vehicles. The first pilot in both cases was destroyed. The T14 was scrapped, and the A33A was lost after being used as a range target. The second pilot of both vehicles survives, however, and are both on display in the Tank Museum's Vehicle Conservation Centre if you want to pay them a visit. I want to say a quick thank you to Anson and Archie B from the channel's Discord for giving me the idea for this video. If you have any suggestions, feedback, or just want to hang out and chat, I'd love to see you in the Discord as well. Link in description. As always, thank you so much. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, and if you want to see some more content from me, it would be great if you could subscribe.